Look, I need to tell someone this because it's been eating at me for months. And honestly, I still think I was just trying to move things along faster. Sometimes you have to take control of your own destiny, right? I'm Brittany, I'm 22, and yes, I did what everyone's making such a big deal about. But here's the thing. Nobody wants to hear. Gary was being impossible about our future, and I was just speeding up what was going to happen anyway. I met Gary at the electronics store where I work. He came in looking for a new phone charger. Typical guy move, waiting until his completely died. He was 25, had this whole responsible adult thing going on with his own place, and steady work in some tech field. Not like the losers I usually dated who still lived with roommates and spent their weekends getting wasted. Gary actually had his shit together, which honestly was refreshing as hell. We started talking, and he asked me out for coffee that same week. I remember thinking this guy could actually be the one. Stable job, his own apartment, talked about wanting a family someday during our third date. Perfect husband material. The first few months were honestly amazing. Gary treated me like a princess, always picking up the check, buying me little gifts, letting me basically move half my stuff into his place without making it weird. He'd cook for me, we'd watch movies, and he seemed genuinely happy when I'd stay over multiple nights in a row. I started posting photos of us together, and all my friends were like, "Finally, Brittany found a good one." His place was so much nicer than my cramped apartment with 2 roommates, and Gary never made me feel like I was imposing when I'd crash there most of the week. But then something shifted around month 4. Gary started making these comments about taking things slow and making sure we're compatible long-term before making any big decisions. I'd bring up my sister's engagement or mention how cute some baby photos were, and he'd smile and nod but never really engage. When I'd hint about moving in officially or talk about our future timeline, he'd change the subject or say something vague like, "We have plenty of time to figure that out." It was starting to piss me off because I wasn't getting any younger, and I could see my life slipping away while he took his sweet time deciding if I was good enough. I started feeling like Gary was just using me for convenience, having a girlfriend to cook for him, sleep with him, basically play house without any of the real commitment. My friends would ask when we were moving in together officially, and I'd have to make excuses for why Gary was being so hesitant. Meanwhile, my sister was planning her wedding. My coworker had just gotten engaged after 8 months of dating, and here I was wasting time with someone who couldn't see what was right in front of him. The more I thought about it, the more frustrated I became. Gary would say things like, "I love spending time with you," and "You make me so happy." But when it came to actual next steps, he'd clam up. I'd try to have serious conversations about where we were headed, and he'd kiss me or suggest we watch a movie instead. It felt like he was keeping me in this relationship limbo on purpose, getting all the benefits of having a girlfriend without having to actually commit to anything real. I started wondering if he was just stringing me along until someone better came along, using me as a placeholder while he figured out what he really wanted. The breaking point came when we'd been together almost 8 months, and Gary mentioned his lease was up for renewal. I thought for sure he'd ask me to move in officially, maybe even suggest we look for a place together. Instead, he renewed his lease for another year without even discussing it with me. When I brought it up, he said he wanted to make sure we were making decisions for the right reasons, and that he didn't want to rush into anything we weren't ready for. I felt like he'd slapped me in the face. That night, lying in his bed, listening to him sleep peacefully while I stared at the ceiling, I realized Gary was never going to take the initiative. He was perfectly content keeping things exactly as they were, having me around when it was convenient, playing house when he felt like it, but never actually stepping up and being a man about our relationship. I was 22 years old, and I wasn't about to waste my prime years waiting for someone to decide if I was worth committing to. Something had to change, and if Gary wasn't going to make it happen, then I would. Gary started asking weird questions about whether I'd been taking my birth control consistently, which honestly annoyed me because he'd never shown that much interest in the details before. I'd tell him yes, obviously, but he'd still insist on using protection every single time. It felt like he didn't trust me, which was rich considering I was the one who should have been questioning his commitment level. He'd make these comments about wanting to be extra careful and make sure we're both on the same page about timing, as if I was some kind of trap waiting to happen. The whole thing felt insulting, like Gary thought I was the type of girl who would try to baby trap him or something. Here I was, being the perfect girlfriend, and he was treating me like I couldn't be trusted with basic relationship responsibilities. Every time he'd grab a condom, it felt like he was putting up another barrier between us, another way of keeping me at arm's length. I started taking it personally, wondering if this was his way of showing he still wasn't serious about our future together. When I'd hint about wanting to take things to the next level, Gary would get this look, like I'd suggested something terrifying. He'd start talking about financial planning and making sure we were ready for major life changes before even considering marriage or kids. Meanwhile, I watched my friends posting engagement photos and pregnancy announcements, moving forward with their lives while I sat there waiting for Gary to get over whatever was holding him back. It felt like everyone else was living their lives while I was stuck in neutral. I started resenting the way Gary would plan everything out so carefully. Like our entire relationship was some kind of business transaction that needed to be analyzed from every angle. Where was the romance? Where was the spontaneity? Where was the guy who was supposed to be so in love with me that he couldn't wait to start our life together? Instead, I got lectures about timing and being responsible, like I was asking him to make some huge sacrifice instead of just acknowledging what we both knew was going to happen eventually anyway. Gary was wasting time we didn't have, and someone needed to help him see that our relationship was ready for the next step. All I did was give fate a little push in the right direction, because honestly, what was the worst that could happen? We'd end up exactly where we're headed anyway, just sooner rather than later. And if Gary really loved me the way he claimed to, then he'd be happy about it once he got over the initial shock of the timing. Looking back now, I still think Gary was being ridiculously overcautious about everything. We'd been together long enough to know we worked well together. We were practically living together anyway, and we'd both talked about wanting families someday. I just helped speed up the timeline a little bit, gave us both the push we needed to stop overthinking everything and actually start our real life together. But apparently, that makes me the bad guy in everyone's story. Gary started coming home from work with this distant look, like his mind was somewhere else entirely. He'd kiss me hello and ask about my day, but I could tell he wasn't really listening to my answers. When I'd try to talk about weekend plans or things I wanted to do together, he'd nod along, but seem distracted. It felt like he was pulling away from me emotionally, and I couldn't figure out what had changed. We'd gone from being inseparable to him acting like spending time with me was some kind of obligation. I tried asking him directly what was wrong, but Gary would just say work was stressful or that he was tired. He'd still sleep in the same bed, still go through the motions of being a boyfriend, but something fundamental had shifted. The easy intimacy we'd had before felt forced now, like he was trying to convince himself as much as me that everything was fine. I started wondering if he was having second thoughts about our relationship, maybe even seeing someone else. The conversations we used to have about random stuff stopped happening. Gary would come home, eat dinner mostly in silence, and then zone out watching TV or scrolling through his phone. When I'd try to engage him, asking about his day or sharing something funny that happened at work, he'd give me these short responses, like he just wanted me to stop talking. It felt like I was annoying him just by existing in his space, which was pretty hurtful, considering how much time and energy I'd invested in our relationship. Even our physical relationship started feeling different. Gary would still initiate sometimes, but it felt mechanical, like he was going through the motions because it was expected rather than because he actually wanted me. The connection we'd had before was disappearing, and I couldn't understand why. I started feeling insecure about everything. The way I looked, the way I acted, whether he still found me attractive or interesting. It was like dating a completely different person. The worst part was that Gary wouldn't just tell me what was bothering him. I would have preferred an honest conversation, even if it was difficult, over this weird emotional distance where I had to guess what was going on in his head. I started feeling like I was walking on eggshells, trying not to say or do anything that might push him further away. It was exhausting trying to be the perfect girlfriend when I couldn't even figure out what was wrong in the first place. Gary's friends started acting weird around me too, which made me think he'd been talking to them about whatever was bothering him instead of talking to me directly. When we'd hang out with Tyler and Becca, they'd be polite but not as warm as they used to be. Kira would make these subtle comments about making sure you're ready for big decisions that felt pointed, like she knew something I didn't. It was obvious Gary had been discussing our relationship with other people instead of working things out with me. I felt like I was being excluded from conversations about my own life, which was incredibly frustrating. Here I was, trying to salvage whatever was going wrong between us, while Gary was apparently getting advice from everyone except the person who actually mattered. It felt disrespectful and immature, like he'd rather complain to his friends than actually address whatever issues he was having with our relationship. I started resenting the way he was handling everything. The tension in his apartment became unbearable. Gary would get home from work and immediately busy himself with random tasks, avoiding any real conversation or quality time together. He'd clean things that were already clean, reorganize closets that didn't need organizing, anything to avoid sitting down and having an actual discussion about what was happening between us. I felt like I was living with a stranger who happened to look like my boyfriend. When I'd bring up the obvious distance between us, Gary would deny anything was wrong and act like I was being dramatic or oversensitive. He'd say things like, "Everything's fine," and "You're imagining things," which made me feel crazy for noticing the obvious changes in his behavior. It was gaslighting, honestly, trying to make me think I was the problem when he was clearly the one who'd checked out of our relationship emotionally. I started thinking maybe Gary was looking for an excuse to break up with me, but was too much of a coward to just do it directly. Maybe he thought if he acted distant enough, I'd get fed up and end things myself, saving him from having to be the bad guy. It felt manipulative and unfair, especially after everything I'd invested in making our relationship work. If he wanted out, he should have just said so instead of putting me through this emotional torture. Gary finally exploded about 3 weeks after I'd noticed the distance starting. He came home from work looking angrier than I'd ever seen him, threw his keys on the counter, and asked if there was anything I needed to tell him. I had no idea what he was talking about, so I asked him to be more specific. That's when he pulled out one of the condoms from his drawer and asked me to explain why there were tiny holes in it. My stomach dropped, but I tried to play it off like I didn't know what he meant. He wasn't buying my confused act, though. Gary laid out 3 more condoms on the kitchen counter, each one with small punctures that were barely visible but definitely there. He'd obviously been inspecting them closely, which felt like a violation of trust in itself. I tried to suggest maybe they'd gotten damaged somehow, or that there was a manufacturing defect, but Gary just stared at me with this disgusted expression I'd never seen before. "I know you did this," he said, his voice completely flat and cold. "I need you to tell me why." The way he was looking at me made me feel like a criminal, which was completely unfair considering everything I'd done for our relationship. I tried to explain that I'd just been trying to help us move forward, that we both wanted the same things anyway, so what was the big deal about speeding up the timeline a little? But Gary wasn't interested in my reasoning. He started yelling about trust and betrayal, and how what I'd done was reproductive coercion, throwing around these dramatic terms like I'd committed some kind of crime. I tried to calm him down, explaining that I loved him and wanted a future with him, that I was just tired of waiting around while he took forever to make decisions about our relationship. But the more I talked, the angrier Gary got. It was like he couldn't see past this one small thing to understand my bigger motivations. Gary told me to pack my stuff and get out, which seemed like a massive overreaction to what was honestly a minor issue. I tried to reason with him, pointing out that we'd been happy together, that we were good for each other, that throwing away our entire relationship over this was insane. But he wouldn't listen to anything I said. He just kept repeating that I'd violated his trust and that he couldn't be with someone who would manipulate him like that. I couldn't believe Gary was willing to throw away everything we'd built together over something so small. We could have worked through this if he'd just been willing to have an actual conversation instead of immediately jumping to the worst possible conclusions. But he'd already made up his mind that I was some kind of monster, and nothing I said was going to change his perspective. It felt like he'd been looking for an excuse to end things, and I'd accidentally given him one. The breakup was brutal and humiliating. Gary wouldn't even look at me while I packed my things, just sat on the couch staring at the wall like I'd already stopped existing. When I tried to talk to him about maybe taking a break and working things out later, he told me not to contact him again. He blocked my number that same night, cut me off from his social media, and basically erased me from his life, like our entire relationship had meant nothing to him. Our mutual friends immediately took Gary's side, which shouldn't have surprised me but still hurt. Kira and Becca stopped responding to my texts. Tyler wouldn't even acknowledge me when I ran into him at the grocery store. And suddenly, I was completely cut off from the social circle I'd been part of for almost a year. It felt like everyone had been waiting for an excuse to get rid of me, and Gary had given them the perfect reason. Within 2 weeks of our breakup, I heard through the grapevine that Gary was already seeing someone new. Some girl from his work who was supposedly so sweet and perfect for him, according to Becca's Instagram stories that I probably shouldn't have been checking. It was like I'd never existed, like our entire relationship had been some kind of placeholder until he found someone better. The speed with which he moved on felt like another slap in the face. I tried reaching out to Gary a few times over the next couple months, hoping maybe he'd cool down and we could have an adult conversation about what happened. But my calls went straight to voicemail, my emails bounced back, and he'd apparently told everyone in our friend group not to pass along any messages from me. It was like I'd been completely erased from his world, and there was nothing I could do to fix things between us. 9 months later, I found out Gary and his new girlfriend were engaged. Engaged after 9 months, when he'd spent almost a year telling me we needed to take things slow and make sure we were ready. Apparently, all that careful planning and consideration only applied when he was with me. With her, he was ready to dive headfirst into forever without any of the hesitation he'd shown about our relationship. It felt like the ultimate betrayal. Now I'm 23, single, and starting over from scratch while Gary gets to play happy families with someone who apparently didn't have to speed things along to get the commitment I'd been waiting for. Everyone acts like he's some kind of victim, and I'm this manipulative witch who destroyed a perfectly good relationship. But honestly, if Gary had just stepped up and been the man I needed him to be from the beginning, none of this would have happened. He created the situation that made me feel like I had to take matters into my own hands. I still think what I did wasn't that big of a deal in the grand scheme of things. Couples deal with unplanned pregnancies all the time, and most of them figure it out and end up stronger for it. Gary was just too immature to handle a little unexpected change in his precious timeline. If he'd really loved me the way he claimed to, he would have seen this as an opportunity for us to start our life together instead of treating it like some kind of betrayal. His reaction told me everything I needed to know about how he really felt about our relationship. The fact that Gary found someone else so quickly and proposed to her after 9 months just proves that I was right about him all along. He was never as committed to our relationship as he pretended to be, and he was probably looking for an excuse to trade up to someone he thought was better. I just happened to give him the perfect reason to feel justified about dumping me. If it hadn't been this, it would have been something else eventually. At least now I know where I really stood with him.